Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever it is you happen to be. Today, we're going to be talking about current history. And so, because we are dealing with more contemporary topics, one of the things that's going to be somewhat lacking here, although not entirely, but some of the things that will be lacking, particularly as we get closer to the late 90s and early 2000s, is a sense of assessment and analysis. That doesn't mean you can't engage in those things, but from a historical point of view, it is very difficult for historians, at least as far as I'm concerned, to be able to fully understand and comprehend the impact of a historical event unless you have some distance from it. So, for example, we can assess the Watergate scandal. We can begin to analyze the impact of stagflation during the 1970s and the demise of industrialization and manufacturing in places like Detroit. We can begin to understand the resurgence of conservatism that occurred during the 1670s and really came to a capstone in the 1980s. But one of the things that becomes a little bit more difficult is to assess the overall impact of, say, the American War on Terror, the impact of Barack Obama's presidency, for example, because we are still very, very close to those events. Although, you might say that we're about 20 years away from September 11th, we can begin to have some insights and understand, of course, what the consequences were. But my point here is simply to state that we are getting closer to contemporary events, and oftentimes when we do that, we get closer to political proclivities, political bias, and at times it can become a point where we become less objective. That's, of course, not my intent here. We want to be as objective as possible. But with that stated, we're going to be looking at a lot of range of different topics this week. And in fact, you're going to note a number of different films that I have provided for you. I've actually broken them up into 4 different decades. My objective is not necessarily for you to absorb everything within every one of those videos, but is to give you kind of a general sense of what has happened in the United States from the 1970s up through about 2000, 2008 with the election of Barack Obama. And so we're going to be talking about different events, different subjects. And so we're going to begin with looking at perhaps one of the most significant events to happen in contemporary history, and that is the Watergate scandal. When we think about the way in which folks perceive their politicians in, say, 2019, 2020, and they're really what we're looking at is people who have a general distrust of their government. And that's not necessarily across the board, but I think more people would say that they believe their politicians are corrupt, that their politicians will lie and cheat and steal in order to get what it is that they want. Part of that, a lot of that has to do with the Watergate scandal that Richard Nixon found himself in, and you couple that alongside with the Vietnam War when news eventually broke out that the government had been lying to the American population about the extent to which we were winning that conflict. All of a sudden, the faith in the American government begins to be shaken. Now, as far as the Watergate scandal goes, you may or may not be aware of this, but Richard Nixon did not necessarily order the hit on the Watergate building. But what he did do was attempt to cover the thing up. And that's really what he got himself in trouble for. One of the things that would have absolutely happened had Nixon not resigned is he would have been impeached. And at the time that I'm doing this lecture, we have now had Donald Trump impeached. Donald Trump is, of course, the 3rd president to be impeached in U.S. history. You've had Bill Clinton before that and Andrew Johnson before him. But Nixon would have been impeached, but he did bail out. And it has a lot to do, of course, with him attempting to cover up the Watergate scandal, paying hush money to various people, not providing tapes to subpoenaed I'm sorry, not wanting to provide tapes, and then ultimately those tapes that had voice narrated recordings, they were subpoenaed, and then there was an extensive 17 to 18-minute break within the tapes. And ultimately, in the end, it really left a bad taste in the mouth of a lot of Americans who came to distrust their government. And in many ways, it helps to bring about the presidency of Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter was a political nobody. No one really knew who he was. He was a one-time governor, peanut farmer. Some folks remember him not so much for himself, but for his beer-drinking brother, where you get Billy Beer. But the thing that really helps Jimmy Carter become president is the fact that he could claim that he was outside of the political scandals that had pervaded during the 1960s, early 1970s, and he was a pure kind of an individual. Jimmy Carter's administration, of all the presidents that we had, he's one of the few that I actually like, although he definitely has a reputation that's not necessarily positive. And the reason for that, I believe, is twofold. During his presidency, you see an economic collapse. There's a run on oil. There were some issues going on in the Middle East where oil became very, very difficult to come by. And what you find, one of the markers of the 1970s is people waiting in stupid long lines to get gas. And you could only get gas on certain days because there was a run on it. There was also something referred to as stagflation going on. Stagflation occurs when you have high inflation and high unemployment that happens at the same time. And really, Carter had a difficult time addressing these problems. And so on one hand, Carter's reputation as a president has sort of been tainted and negative in large measure because of these economic woes that occurred in the 1970s. But you also had a momentous event known as the Iran hostage crisis, where a number of Americans were kidnapped by Iranian revolutionaries. I don't want to call them revolutionaries nonetheless, but for lack of a better term, they attack the embassy and they take these Americans hostage. And Jimmy Carter attempted as best he could to deal with the situation diplomatically. The hostages would not be released until he was no longer president. In fact, they were on a plane in Tehran waiting for Ronald Reagan, who would come after Jimmy Carter. Once Ronald Reagan gave his speech becoming president, they were released. But despite the failures of Jimmy Carter's presidency, he also contributed to bringing some peace between Egypt and the State of Israel with the Camp David Accords. He has a strategic arms limitation treaty known as SALT, which was put in place to help ease Cold War tensions. And in many ways, I think Jimmy Carter is an interesting character. I think he's done more after being president to perhaps forward his sort of moral agenda. One of the things that's interesting and is said about Jimmy Carter is that he had very strong religious convictions. And he tried to bring those religious convictions to the presidency, and they just didn't play well. Some historians have said that Jimmy Carter was naive and he just didn't understand what was going on. But nonetheless, Jimmy Carter's presidency is a reflection on the fact that many folks did not trust the political system at hand. Following Jimmy Carter, you get Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan is an interesting cat for a number of reasons, but one of the things I want to stress here in this video is that Ronald Reagan epitomizes the resurgence of conservatism. Following the Great Depression, conservatism had sort of died off, and the New Deal coalition that was formed following the Great Depression really meant that conservative Republicans, conservatism itself, sort of took a back seat to New Deal Democratic policies. If you're familiar with the Great Society policies under Lyndon Baines Johnson, this is a continuation of some of those New Deal ideas. And the idea behind the New Deal, and of course the Great Society, particularly more the Great Society, but the New Deal as well, is that the government seemed to be passing legislation, doing things that benefited what some folks referred to as minority status people. And by that, of course, we mean non-white people. You look at the Civil Rights Acts of 64, the Voting Rights Act 65, 64, 65, right? And many folks within American society began to feel that the government was not looking out for their interests. And a lot of that was working class white individuals. And so there is a resurgence of conservatism that sort of hits the stage. You think of people like Richard Nixon and Barry Goldwater and obviously Ronald Reagan, who are playing upon some of the concerns that these folks have. And you can think of things like the law and order. There's a breakdown of law and order. People like Ronald Reagan would tout that all the time. In fact, when Ronald Reagan was governor of California, one of the things that he talked about doing all the time was cleaning up the mess at Berkeley. And what that meant was he was not happy with the student protesters. He was not happy with more progressive style ways of thinking. If you think back to the 1920s when we talked about the competition between modernism and conservatism or traditionalism, you sort of see that happen again in the 1980s. In fact, it is sort of borne out in a war that is referred to as the culture wars. And the culture wars really were discourses and debates and differences over a number of different issues, including religion and family values. You look at the AIDS epidemic of the 1980s, and there's a deep concern about homosexuality. And ultimately, there are folks within the conservative line who believe that family values, family lifestyles, traditional beliefs are going down the toilet. They are being threatened by Roe v. Wade. They are being threatened by the gay rights movement. They are being threatened by women's liberation and second wave feminism, and a range of other different movements. Your book talks about some of these, so make sure that you get into that. But the culture wars really does punctuate the 1980s. In fact, reading from your textbook here, if I can find it, it states, no, that's not what I want. Sorry, guys. I sort of lost my spot here. So, for example, let me give you a big for example here. This is from your textbook. It says, homosexuals were left to forge their own response to the AIDS crisis. Some turned to confrontation, like New York playwright Larry Kramer. Kramer founded the gay men's health crisis, which demanded a more proactive response to the epidemic. Part of the culture wars would have suggested that the AIDS epidemic was God's judgment upon the homosexual community. And some people went so far as to argue that AIDS research for a cure should not even be had, that AIDS should just wipe out this segment of the population because in their minds, the homosexual community, the LGBT community, was an abomination to traditional practices. You're actually going to watch a film this week that talks about this movement. But the culture wars are interesting, nonetheless. There's also an issue during Reagan's administration. He's going to attempt to he's gonna try and be a fiscal conservative in some respects. He wants to cut social welfare spending. He wants to cut Social Security. Again, as governor of California, he cut spending to education. He cut spending to mental health services. And what Reagan really wants to do is to get the economy kick-started again. And it doesn't, at least not right away. By 1982-83, the economy is still very sluggish. And one of the things that he's going to want to do is to balance the budget. So he's going to make all these cuts into social spending, but he's also going to increase military spending exponentially, right? I mean, if you think about your own home budget, you can't say that I want to balance budget and cut back on going out to eat, but then you go out and you buy, a boat, a jet ski, and a new car. That's just not going to work. You're not going to balance your budget that way. But part of the reason why Reagan, I believe, is doing that is he views the Soviet Union in a light that's, I don't want to say that Reagan viewed the Soviet Union as an evil empire, the way in which George W. Bush viewed certain nations, but he definitely was critical of the Soviet Union, and some argue, I think wrongfully, this isn't to say that Reagan deserves some credit, but wrongfully argue that Reagan is the reason why the Cold War ultimately came to an end, why the Soviet Union collapsed. I think that's unfair because there were a number of leaders within the Soviet Union who made changes to the USSR's practices. But nonetheless, Reagan's presidency ushers in a new wave of conservatism. It also ushers in a moment in which the Cold War is going to heat up and then cool down once the Soviet Union does collapse in 1989. I'm sorry, the Berlin Wall comes down in 1989. The Soviet Union falls in 1991. But following Reagan's presidency, conservatism still has its way. You're going to get George H.W. Bush will become president during his administration. You're going to see the end of the Cold War. You're going to see the Gulf War. The Gulf War occurred when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. A lot of that had to do with oil and the sale of oil. Ultimately, a very short conflict, one that the United States was successful in winning, although George H.W. Bush did get criticized for not going into Saddam Hussein's home country and chasing him down and capturing him. This, of course, will be something that his son, George W. Bush, will do during his tenure as president. As, of course, we roll into the 90s and the early 2000s, you're going to get to deal with presidents Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton attempts to do a number of different things, but, of course, like so many others who come into scandal, his presidency and reputation is going to always be tainted by the Monica Lewinsky scandal. It's for that he's impeached. Not so much having sex with her, which he would tell you, I did not have sex with that woman, right? And then he says, but I did, just kidding, right? And in many ways, he sort of redefines what sexual intercourse means, right? But he gets in trouble for lying about it. And he doesn't get thrown out of office, but he is impeached. Bill Clinton is really more of a Democratic moderate than he is more of a left-wing liberal. And Bill Clinton was an individual who a lot of people liked and continue to still like. Perhaps even more than the man who came after him, who's George W. Bush. And, of course, what he's mostly remembered for is September 11th and the attack upon the Twin Towers. And, of course, that raises important questions as well, questions that I think are still being borne out to this very day about the nature of terrorism, the nature of civil liberties, right? We'll talk this week a bit about the Patriot Act and, you know, the whole idea behind whether or not it is acceptable to violate civil liberties in order to protect the nation, right? And this is a question that doesn't just occur during George W. Bush's administration, right? We can think all the way back to, say, FDR's administration and locking up Japanese Americans because they were feared to be espionage agents. You can go back to Lincoln's administration and his suspension of habeas corpus, locking people up without being charged. So you have all these things, right? And ultimately, where we're going to end is with the election of Barack Obama. And I'm not going to get into Barack Obama's administration too much, but one of the things I do want to state about this is that when he was elected president, one of the things you heard repeatedly was that we have now entered into a colorblind society. And I want to say personally that I think that that is a very dangerous perspective to have. And what many people are trying to convey when they say they live in a colorblind society is that they do not see race. They just see people. And I think what they're trying to say is that they're not racist. They don't judge people by their race. And that's fantastic. I don't think we should do that. As an anti-racist, I believe we should not do that. But the problem with arguing that you don't see color is that if you don't see color, then you miss the actual histories and abuses and accomplishments of different groups of people, right? The African American experience, the Latin American experience, the Asian American experience, and we can even break those down to Japanese, Chinese, Filipino, Korean, even various groups, Germans, Irish, Italians, you pick them. They have all had unique experiences based upon their ethnicity, and it's necessary for us to identify and be aware of those differences so that we can really understand the way in which those ethnicities, those races, those backgrounds shape the history of not just the United States as a whole, but these people specifically. Be interested to hear what you guys have to say about that. But of course, Barack Obama's election to the presidency is a cornerstone, right? You can even think back in the 1980s, even the 1990s, it may have been unthinkable to have had an African-American president. And so that's where we're going to leave off. I know I covered a lot of different things here, sort of skipped the surface, but there's a lot to cover in this last session. So hopefully that's helpful. If you have questions, let me know. Otherwise, as always, go in peace, be warm and filled. May the force be with you, live long and prosper, and may the odds forever be in your favor. Have a blessed week, everybody.